Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the presentation on web technologies. This is unfortunately going to be quite a long presentation, but ultimately there's quite a lot of technologies which are involved within web development, web design, and we're going to go over some of them. Like some of the other presentations that we've done, it's not an exhaustive list, so there might be other things which I don't necessarily cover, which you may want to consider at a later date. So these are some of the things we're going to cover. So we're going to look at some languages. So we've got HTML, CSS, a bit of JavaScript, PHP, ASP.NET. Now, in this example, I'm not going to teach you anything regarding actually making something out of those languages. So we're going to, you'd need to go to a separate video regarding the actual creation of that stuff. But it is important to kind of know about them and be able to talk about them. The internet against the World Wide Web, because they're not the same thing, commonly used interchangeably by a lot of people. We've got routers, domain names, ISPs, Web 123, and WAMP and LAMP. Now, with a lot of this stuff, I'm not going to delve massively into detail about how it works. You're free to look at that stuff outside of this video, but just kind of be aware that, let's say, for example, if I was going to have an in-depth discussion about how routers work, I would probably be here for about 2 hours with this presentation, maybe even more than that. So ultimately it's just kind of an overview of this stuff, and if you really want to delve into more detail, then one of the great things about web is there's so much stuff out there that you guys can use. So we'll start off at the very beginning. So the base language for all web pages is HTML, which is Hypertext Markup Language, and it's commonly a lot of people think that HTML and CSS, for that matter, are programming languages. They're not. They're designed to structure pages. If you actually create something in HTML, it doesn't do anything like a programming language would. That's where something like a JavaScript would come in. So you would use JavaScript to actually make your web page do something. So HTML is what you'd use to structure your web page. Doesn't actually do any of the real styling. It just kind of says where pages would be laid out, what content, or what container maybe would go where. CSS is where you start to get a little bit more complex, but generally it is a bit of a struggle to use or to create a website that looks anything like a half-decent site without using some CSS. We will come to look at it more in depth when we do the videos specifically on this topic. But ultimately, it is quite commonly used. Well, I say quite commonly used. It's stating the obvious, really. Is what we use to style pages, and with CSS3, it's become a lot more powerful. A little while back, we thought various different things were going to come in and make it very fancy, such as your Flash or Animate as it is now, your XHTML, and so on. But actually CSS is currently, anyway, trumping all of them, and it is generally what we would use to do a lot of the styling within your website. And we can do an awful lot of stuff with CSS these days, which is a really cool thing. So JavaScript I did kind of allude to earlier. So JavaScript is not to be confused with straight Java. Okay, Java is a separate programming language. It's frankly a lot harder, although it is still kind of used with web applications. The JavaScript is the programming language used within web development, and there's lots of different things you can do with it. So if you think of web development as HTML is the way it's structured, like the skeleton, CSS is applying some looks to it, it'll make it look pretty, and JavaScript is actually making it do something useful. And that's not to say that we definitely need it on every site, but ultimately for the more complex sites you're definitely going to be using it. You've got lots of different libraries available to it, so I've just listed 3 here. So you've got jQuery, React, Angular. They've all got their pros and cons. Some of them are designed to change the content in the site in order to make it update various different parts without updating other parts of the website. So you might see that in a Sport Live Text, for example, or you might see that in a search engine within the website itself. You might use that, but there's lots of different stuff, and ultimately jQuery was popular a few years back. It's not quite so popular now. Things like React and Angular are very popular currently, and I mean they're relatively obvious as to what they do. So React is designed to react to the user's requests and be able to create responsive sites. I said, obviously, if you want to have a good look at those outside of this video, you're more than welcome to do so. All of those are 3 libraries that you can just download. You got server-side scripting as well. Server-side scripting is so generally with web pages. You can see that this is the standard client. So probably if you're trying to look at a website, will request the web page. That's where you put in the URL, so www.whatever-it-might-be.com. It will get sent to the server through your router and various different technologies. Get sent to the server. That will happen in a nanosecond, and then it will say, okay, can you find this web page for me? And then the server will serve it to the client, and it will appear on your screen, which is why there's generally a slight delay when you look at it. And there could be obviously some issues there in terms of if one of these 2 servers is or web connections, so broadband or fiber, whatever they're using, is slower, then you'll find a delay happening there. This is called client-side scripting, okay, because everything is executed here on the client machine. The server-side scripting is where you might get something that's executed on the server, which is when you might start to get this sort of thing come into play. So let's say you have a big shop and you have a database full of all of your products. That database is going to be held here, isn't it? You're not going to send that database to your client. That doesn't make any sense. So if you're doing a query, so you're doing a search for specific products, the client's done that, for example, it will get sent to the server, and it'll be, okay, well, this person is searching for whatever they're searching for, let's say a DVD of some sort. It will then search here using this sort of script. So PHP, ASP.NET are 2 of the most common. So PHP is 3, stands for Pre-Hypertext Processor, and ASP stands for Active Server Page. The PHP is open source and will come part as the LAMP or WAMP suite, which we'll discuss later on. ASP.NET is Microsoft's version of it, and you'll need to install IIS, and I can never off the top of my head remember exactly what that stands for. But it's something like Information Systems Integrated, something like that. And basically it's where you turn your machine into a server. And that will process on the server if you're doing that search, and then you'll get a result from that, and it will get sent back to the client, which is why sometimes you might get a slightly longer response than if it was just this, okay, because something has to happen here before it can be returned to the client. Now, server-side scripting is not massively more complex, to be honest, than your standard web scripting, but obviously it does make your web page a lot more powerful. You can do things like processing orders, you can do things like having a customer database, and that means that you can have things like mailing lists and all sorts that you can start to advertise your products some more. Yes, it can be a lot more powerful. I'm not actually going to show that. This is a video from the IT Crowd, which is was quite a popular comedy in the UK. You guys can have a look at that if you want. I thought it was quite funny. It's something that I do show my students within the class. But basically, what the the serious part of that is, we're looking at now World Wide Web, the internet. So I said it's a term which people use interchangeably, but they're not actually the same thing. So you might get people going, "Oh, my internet's down," or "Oh, my web's down." Well, that's actually not the same thing. The actual thing that they'll be referring to is the internet. The internet is basically a network of networks. Okay, it's huge. It's much older. It was developed first of all in the United States, something called ARPANET. Ultimately, I said I'm not going to delve too much in detail about that, but there's lots of stuff out there. It was developed initially by the United States Army, I believe, in about 1960 odd. Give or take a few years. And the World Wide Web didn't come around until 1989, when Tim Berners-Lee, who's a British inventor, actually inventor might be the wrong word, but basically he kind of made it more available to the world. And the thing is that ultimately World Wide Web is very structured pages, so you use your HTML, you use your Hypertext Transfer Protocol, your HTTP, which is on the front of your URL, and that's kind of where that comes in. But don't forget that you don't have to be using web pages to use the internet, and that's where kind of you might get a little bit confused. So, if you're doing a Skype phone call, you might not be using any web pages at all, or if you're sending data from point A to point B, you might not be using web pages. So, the internet is a much bigger thing. A web server. So, if we go back to here, you can see the word server here. So this is where all your web pages are stored. Any computer can become a web server, and basically when a user, so a client, requests a web page, it will get sent from your browser to wherever the server is stored, and go, "Oi, I want to find this web page," and then it will get sent back to the user, and generally this happens very quickly. So that any computer can become a web server, but there are a number of barriers. So, for example, the complexity of setting it up. Okay, you generally would need to know a fair bit about the actual technology behind it in order to set it up, especially the way that you want it. Bandwidth is going to be an issue, because if your bandwidth is not very high and you set your computer to be a server, then basically what you're saying is, okay, people, in order to access the site, will be using your bandwidth. Okay, so they'll be coming in and out of your site trying to get this data all the time. And if your broadband access or fiber, whatever it is, isn't high enough, it's going to really slow it down. It's going to slow your experience down as well, because if you're trying to look at it from somewhere else, then it's going to be slow, but it's going to slow their experience down. Remember that ultimately, as an end user, if you're finding it slow, you're just likely to go elsewhere. And the last one is probably the biggest one, where you've got security. Obviously, if you're making your computer available to the world, then it's not going to take a particularly highly skilled hacker to be able to go in and breach your security and find out whatever's on there. That's where you're really, big businesses have a lot of security there. Lots of very well paid people to get all their stuff protected. We've got ISPs, Internet Service Provider. Will provide access to the internet generally for a cost, which can be as low as a couple of pounds and as high as I said as high as whatever. Ultimately, for a business, it could be as high as name your price, really. Especially if you've got hundreds of thousands of people accessing at once. You might want to pay quite a lot of money for that, really. Packages will vary in connection speed, bandwidth, so that's the speed that you're going to get your data transferred. Security, storage space, specialization settings, and support. So you might be able to, ISPs might provide you with email, for example. They might provide you with space that you could put a potential website, but the downside is that your URL will be something like www.bt.com/this/that/another .yoursite.html, and that's not something an end user is going to remember ever, really. Most popular ISPs in the UK, you've got BT, Sky, Virgin, TalkTalk. The others are much smaller. Now, that was found think it was 2018 I found that, so the figures might be slightly changed by now, but they're not going to be so far changed that these four are still not going to be the biggest. The next highest one from memory was about 400,000, so it's not going to change that much over the last few years. Okay, so this was a survey in 2018, so they didn't give us a sample size, but what they're basically saying here is that people who were with TalkTalk generally were not very satisfied. But having said that, this is not high. 80% satisfaction is not high. All of these numbers, 15% customers with reasons to complain is 1 in 6. That's too high. And again, that this number here is satisfaction with complaint handling too low. And there are various different reasons for that. I'm sure TalkTalk will have changed some stuff since 2018, but you never know. Databases we used to store data acquired from customers or to populate the website. So like I said, we could be storing data from customers in terms of where they live, in terms of previous orders, etc. Now you've got to be quite careful. I get the word out, and you've got to be quite careful these days because of things like GDPR. But ultimately, we need to be holding the data somewhere. We need to be quite careful with it. We've also got things like product details that we can hold in databases that people can search. You could have addresses and contact details for suppliers. I had a bit of a mind blank then. And you pretty much anything you can think of you can hold in a database, really. So commonly used databases with websites are MySQL, Oracle. You don't really want to be using Access. It's not really big enough as a database bit of software, because with any one Access database you can have 200 people accessing at once, and for a website it's just not, if your website's going to be anything like popular, that's just not enough. Think of the amount of customers that might want to use it. You think of yourself, you might be processing orders and all of your stuff. It's just not big enough. And you obviously need to have your database stored on the web server. Okay, it doesn't get stored on the client. That would be pretty crazy. And especially if it was the customer details, you'd probably end up in jail or in serious trouble. Domain name. So your website itself isn't actually what you see. Okay, so you see a name www.google.com, but it's actually not really that. It's actually an IP address, which is a long string of numbers. Now, humans are not very good at remembering numbers. If you think about how much problems people have with remembering things like phone numbers, if you think that how many websites we visit, we would simply be unable to remember all of those numbers. It would be a nightmare. You'd only ever visit about 3 sites, which obviously is not good. So we attach a domain name, which could be www.whatever.com, and the endings have there's a number of examples of them. So you've got .com, .co.uk, .net. There are loads now. The W3C have just brought out an absolute stack of new endings, which to represent the type of company that is using that domain name. So let's say for college you could have .ac.uk, for example, or you could have .org.uk, and it's meant to kind of help because there's so many places using websites these days that there simply aren't enough other domain names available for them. First account created in 1986. I've gotten here that domain name structure is a level 3 topic. It ultimately is. It's not something I'm going to cover in this video, and it's not necessarily something that everybody will need to cover. Web hosting. So you can choose to take this out of your own hands, like I said, by you can set up your company on a server on your own computers if you want. I've kind of alluded to that previously. Obviously, disadvantages with things like broadband and security issues with that and complexity. You can also pay somebody to host it for you. It's extremely common, especially with smaller sites. So you have things such as, obviously there's support that you could potentially have with that. You could have things such as if the technology is updated in some way, it would automatically update the host for you rather than you having to go in and change it. You could have help desk, content management systems, things like WordPress. It's always going to be on, or it should always be on. The downtime will be a lot less. So if you were hosting this yourself, you would need to have your computer turned on all the time, which could be an issue. You've got examples. Two of the biggest are One-on-One, GoDaddy. There are lots of others out there. You guys can do a bit of a search to actually find it. Some of the range. I mean, some of you may even be using different examples, and that's fine. You don't have to talk necessarily about the ones that I mentioned there. It's just that in the past I used to use One-on-One, so it's one of the more obvious ones for me. That also uses things like WordPress, so that's quite useful. But there are other web hosts out there. Some that specialize in ASP, some that specialize in PHP, and some that specialize in WordPress, and you name it really. You've got WAMP and LAMP. Okay, so these are a suite of open source resources that you could potentially use to help turn your machine into web servers, and it comes with all your PHP, your MySQL, your Apache, and so on. So you can use all of this open source goodness in order to kind of turn your website and computer into a web host. It's not easy. Okay, so in terms of a novice might find it quite difficult to actually set it up. You would need a fair amount of actual software of experience with doing something like this. Either that, or you're going to need quite a lot of help. But it is a good thing to use if you have the opportunity to do it. So the difference between the two of them is WAMP is for Windows and LAMP is for Linux. Other than that, there's not an awful lot of difference between them. Web 2.0, or actually more relevantly right now, Web 3.0. So when the web was initially created in 1989 all the way up to the late 1990s, the web was very static. Okay, so however the website was designed would be the way that the end user would see the website, which sounds amazing, right? But actually, as an end user, you had no say in the way the website looked. It was the same for everybody. And actually, by the time we were getting to the end of the 1990s, the dot-com bubble was about to burst, and the web was trying to find a way to reinvent itself. And things like Web 2.0 came in, and basically we're looking at greater integration of how the end user impacts on their own experiences, really. So you're looking at, let's use a very basic example whereby you could log on to Amazon, and it will say, the last time you were on Amazon you bought Lord of the Rings, therefore we're going to suggest that you buy The Hobbit. So therefore, your experience has been tailored based on what you've done previously. And there are lots of different examples. You've got your social media, whereby you could be browsing through your Facebook page, and on that it could be, you've liked you like this football club, therefore we're suggesting that you like these fan pages, or you've said that you like football, therefore you could visit, Sports Soccer and buy yourself an England football kit, or a football or football boots, whatever it might be. It's basically tailored from your end use. Currently, Web 3.0, the awarding bodies haven't caught up with Web 3.0, it is still quite new, is where we're using the web basically everywhere to help control our lives. quite scary, to be honest, if you think about some of the stuff that's coming in. I mean, the theories behind it are all well and good, but I think they need to just make sure they're in control of everything before it, really kind of gets let loose. There were a couple of examples, that it was, I think it was Google Glass, where you had the funky glasses, and when you were walking around, it would pop up with all of the things that you might be interested in. So it's kind of all around us all the time. Not just on websites. It's kind of integrated into every aspect of our life these days, which is cool and scary at the same time. And quite where that will go yet, I mean, I don't think we're really sure. I mean, we're literally just at the start of that lifespan of Web 3.0, and where it goes from there, we will see. Last slide. These are examples of the types of things that came in with Web 2.0. So you've got blogs and wikis. So blog is a weblog, an online diary. Now you may be thinking, well, why don't we just write it? Handwritten, because that's a diary too, right? But that is true. But in terms of having it online, it gives you so many potential other options, such as you can get lots of people potentially viewing, commenting. You can see other people's blogs about what they've been doing, about potential ideas that you can do. Lots and lots of different stuff. There's lots of microblogging sites out there, such as Twitter. It is quite popular these days. A lot of blogs are monetized these days. Some people out there that make quite a lot of money from them. Wikis, this is the very last point from this presentation. One of most common things that I see is people going, wiki, therefore it's Wikipedia. And while Wikipedia is a wiki, it is not the only wiki, okay? And it is the most famous one, but it is not the only one, okay? So it's basically an online resource that lots of people can contribute to. I mean, the likelihood is that at some point you've used a different wiki somewhere along the line. So let's say, for example, I play Skyrim quite a lot. There is a wiki out there for Skyrim that anybody can use, anybody can access. So there's lots of different examples out there. Okay, well, I've managed to ramble on for over 27 minutes. So thank you very much for watching. I mean, ultimately, this isn't an exhaustive list. There is still more out there. And you can look into all this stuff into more depth and find out more about it. And a lot of these technologies are very, exciting. They're very, we'll see where they're going to end up in the future. But like I said, thank you very much for watching. I hope that has helped. I will see you soon.